That's why I'm standing here today, because of those efforts, because of that legacy.
President Obama making a direct connection between his life and the political achievements of LBJ. Tonight we're bringing you highlights from the final day of the Civil Rights Summit, including speeches from President Obama and former President Bush. Segregation may be over, but the racial income gap is still largely in place. We're talking live with LBJ school economist James Galbraith about what it looks like today. And voting rights in Texas are on the minds of many this week. Civil rights activist Jesse Jackson joins us to give his take, plus our political strategists Harold Cook and Ted DeLisi debate more of the political issues unique to Texas. Capitol Tonight starts right now. And thanks very much for joining us here for this special edition of Capitol Tonight, live from the UT campus and the LBJ Library, where the Civil Rights Summit, the three-day Civil Rights Summit, has wrapped up. I'm Paul Brown, and President Obama was one of two presidents here, of course, our incumbent, and we'll have more on what he had to say in a moment. But speaking of the Obama administration, some big news coming out of Washington today that Kathleen Sebelius, Health and Human Services Secretary, has announced her resignation. Of course, she was in charge of healthcare.gov, which had the very poor rollout back in October, and so in light of all of that, she announced the resignation. We understand that the president did know about this about a month ago, but it is formal today, and we'll talk more about that a little bit later here on the show. But the day today here with President Obama was focused on civil rights and the 50th anniversary of the signing of the Civil Rights Act by President Johnson. And when he spoke to the crowd, it was quite a moving moment. Our Karina Kling was able to listen in on what he had to say, and really, given the fact that he's our first African-American president, a very poignant speech.
Yeah, definitely, Paul. The president spoke very candidly about President Johnson's struggles to create change in the country. President Obama also gave President Johnson a lot of credit for where he is today, thanks to the efforts of LBJ.
We shall overcome.
A crowd of about 1,000 packed into the LBJ auditorium rose to its feet, swaying and singing along to Mavis Staples' rendition of We Shall Overcome.
We shall overcome.
Civil rights icon and Congressman John Lewis then introduced President Barack Obama, pointing to how far we've come to now see him serving as president.
Without the leadership of President Lyndon Johnson, there will be no President Jimmy Carter, no President Bill Clinton, no President Barack Obama.
And President Obama credited LBJ for his ability and leadership to bring about change.
Because of the civil rights movement, because of the laws President Johnson signed, new doors of opportunity and education swung open for everybody.
President Obama talked about Johnson facing pushback to pass the Civil Rights Act and his use of presidential power to sign what he believed was right into law.
What the hell's the presidency for? If not to fight for causes you believe in.
He also compared LBJ's critics to his own problems in passing the health care law.
President Johnson fought for and argued and horse-traded and bullied and persuaded until ultimately he signed the Civil Rights Act into law.
President Obama also took time to tour the LBJ Library exhibit, looking back at the story of America LBJ helped write and what he says he hopes is still yet to come.
And if there is one thing that he in this year's anniversary should teach us, if there's one lesson I hope that Malia and Sasha and young people everywhere learn from this day, it's that with enough effort and enough empathy and enough perseverance and enough courage, people who love their country can change it.
And we
Now, Paul, the LBJ auditorium, where all four of the presidents spoke this week, was the last place that President Johnson spoke publicly before he died.
Karina, thank you very much. You know, the president was greeted today by some protesters, although they were probably about a football or so field length away from where he arrived here midday. They were protesting the deportation of non-criminal undocumented citizens, something that they say is on the rise, and they would like the president to take executive action, much like he did with some younger immigrants, children who were brought here, and they were deferred their deportations, several 100,000 of them earlier in the year. They'd like him to do that before immigration reform is resolved. 3 people were detained. We believe that they are the 3 among them who chained themselves to the MLK statue the previous day. So that was something that greeted the president, and we're going to be talking a little bit about immigration reform a little bit later here in the show. Also today, President Bush was here, George W. Bush. He came to speak a lot about education, and he had his focus on equal education, and here's part of what President Bush said about that.
Some have ideological objections to any federal role in education. Some are too comfortable with the status quo. The alliance between ideology and complacency seems to be getting stronger. I fear that the soft bigotry of low expectations is returning.
Of course, President Bush was part of the No Child Left Behind Act during his presidency, worked with Senator Edward Kennedy, the late senator now, on that effort. But the conversation began today with a lighthearted note. In fact, the president was probably the most casual in his speech delivery and comfortable that we've seen in quite some time. And he began with this line.
Former presidents compare their libraries the way other men may compare their, well, I was just wondering how LBJ would have handled that.
So he even tied in the funny remark to the LBJ legacy. So some lighthearted moments here during this 3-day summit on civil rights. There's much more to come here on this special edition of Capitol Tonight as we wrap up this 3-day summit. We're going to be talking more about education, as what President Bush talked about. There was a panel discussion on that. We'll have more on that. And also pay inequality. That is an issue of today when it comes to civil rights. James Galbraith from the University of Texas is an expert in that field. We'll talk about that. We'll talk about LBJ's war on poverty. That and more when Capitol Tonight continues.